Right, okay, that's fine. Let's just go. So what we're going to cover, I think, so Emma is going to start off and talking about your community shared ownership and what it is we're actually trying to cover. We're looking at types of community shared ownership projects, and then looking at the models for community organisation. Then I'm going to come in with that spotlight on joint ventures and what we mean by that, and means by which we can structure those, and things, points, I suppose, to think about, when you are engaging, with private sector in relation to renewable energy projects. So I'm going to pass over to Emma.
Thanks, Graham. Sorry, folks, I'm not quite sure what's going on with our slides, but we'll make them available after the session as well, and hopefully they'll start to catch up now. So yes, as Graham said, I just want to spend a short bit of time just on a brief introduction to community shared ownership, what we mean by that. I know a number of you would have been on the call last week with Mark and Christina, so I don't want to reinvent that detail or discuss the kind of various policy considerations around that. But I thought it would be useful just before we kind of launch into some of the detail on the legal structures piece, just to spend a bit of time about what we actually mean by community shared ownership. So community shared ownership, as we'll know, provides community groups the chance to, make an investment in a commercially owned renewable energy project. It ties in really closely with Scottish Government policy considerations in this area around energy consumption, net zero targets, etc., and the real belief that actually shared ownership by communities can play a key role in that. And we see that coming through from some of the things that come from government. Scottish governments have good practice principles in this area, which again is a useful starting point. And they define, community shared ownership as being any structure which involves a community group as a financial partner over the lifetime of a renewable energy project. I suppose what is community shared ownership not, and I think Mark sort of mentioned this in his terms of his role, community shared ownership it should be seen very differently from community benefits. It's distinct from community benefits. It's not an either or situation. It should very much be seen as an in addition to the offering from the community benefits offering. And as Graham sort of mentioned there in his introduction, there are a variety of different types of projects that come under this community shared ownership banner. Someone talking about doing a community shared ownership project could mean very different things depending on who you're speaking to. And helpfully within the various different categories of projects that we see, so too do we see a number of different legal structures as well. And so it's not a one size fits all. And again, looking to the Scottish Government good practice principles and guidelines actually sets out quite clearly that, it is a kind of a bespoke approach required in various scenarios. And so what that means, I suppose, from a kind of legal structures perspective is actually that there are going to be a variety of different options open to you in terms of that community shared ownership project. I'm just going to stop sharing that, sorry, because I can't seem to. So different types of community shared ownership projects then we're going to touch on the kind of three main categories that we quite often see. So joint ventures, shared revenue, and split ownership. And again, as I've said, there can be a variety of different options and models within each of those categories in and of themselves, so further subcategorized as well. So the first category then is shared revenue, and it's defined as being a legally constituted community organisation buying the rights to a future virtual revenue stream, which will be calculated on the basis of a specified proportion of the output of an installation, less agreed operating costs, and generally less virtual debt service. The piece in italics there, and you'll come on to see that in the next couple of examples that I give as well, a legally constituted community organisation. That's really important, and that's what we're going to be spending a bit of time on as well in terms of, okay, well, what does that look like and how do we structure that? But just taking another breath then on shared revenue. So really the idea being here that the commercial operator develops the project, engages with a community of individuals during that process, and then offers a revenue share to that community entity. That community entity then raising capital and will continue to have then a financial stake in the development going forward, and will share in hopefully the profits. But importantly, in the shared revenue context, doesn't own any physical assets associated with the project. So yeah, this is something I'd say we don't see as frequently as other types of projects, although there are certain larger scale developers who do offer this type of community shared ownership project. So it is something that we do see from time to time. Another category then of community shared ownership type of project, but something that we probably see fairly infrequently, is the kind of idea of a split ownership type project. So again, something that requires a legally constituted community organisation, and that community organisation will own a proportion of a development's physical assets. So this approach really is where a scheme can be divided into two or potentially even more separate sort of generating systems, each of which producing energy for the benefit of an identified owner, one of which would be a community entity and the other typically being the commercial project developer. As I said, this is something that we see fairly infrequently and has become kind of less prevalent in recent times for various reasons. Where we tend to see the bulk of our kind of involvement in these types of projects, and certainly in considering the kind of approaches that we've had recently, tends to be more in this space of a joint venture community shared ownership project. And so this is where your commercial operator, and again that definition of your legally constituted community organisation, working together to create a joint venture to develop, own and manage a project. I suppose it's important probably just to pause to note as well that there can be various levels of joint, from a kind of complete collaboration through to, you know, the community simply acquiring an acquisition of an equity stake in an existing SPV. And so even using, you know, the category of a joint venture community shared ownership project actually can mean different things depending on the context. But in this instance, really, the community is deriving benefit from that partnership with the developer. The developer would carry the risks at the kind of early stages of the project, but also the kind of expectation there is that, you know, a developer can bring experience and knowledge to the project. And we'll come on to focus in a bit more detail on joint ventures as the presentation develops, because as I say, that is an area where we tend to see quite a lot of activity. But for just now, I'm going to focus a bit on the types of models for the legally constituted community organisation. So if we think back to the kinds of categories of projects that we see, so joint ventures, split revenue, split ownership, shared ownership rather, in each instance, a key part of that is that there is a legally constituted community organisation in place. It's required. And so this next section of the presentation, I'm going to look at that in a bit more detail. This aligns with Scottish Government good practice principles again about expectations on communities, and that there should be this single community entity being utilised or created, which can be formed of a number of different community groups, but that there should be this one kind of central community lead organisation, if you like. And so in this section, I'm just going to consider some of the key considerations for a community in determining what the most appropriate model will be. And there are a number of factors to take into account. I'm also going to take a bit of a run through what those legal structures are how you would form them, how they're regulated, and a bit around some of the benefits and drawbacks of each of those types of models. And I'll also touch on some of the key features that would be required to be reflected in a constitutional document of the legally constituted community organisation, because there are some common themes irrespective of the type of model that is utilised. So, as I noted earlier, there are a variety of different factors to consider in determining which legal structure is going to be most appropriate for your community shared ownership project. So you've potentially had an approach, or you are considering making an approach to a developer. And one of the first things or one of the kind of key things will be, okay, we're going to need this legal model, but what should that model be? I'm going to run through some of the kind of key considerations, although they will be very kind of project specific, but these are some of the things that you ought to be thinking about from a very early stage, because the answers to some of these points will determine which legal structures are appropriate and which are perhaps less appropriate. So the first is kind of around assets, either acquiring assets or protecting of assets. So is the intention that this project is going to see the community vehicle acquire physical assets? Various kind of things associated with that in terms of your legal structure. Protection of assets, also another really important thing. So it might be that actually there is already in existence a community organisation that could take forward the community shared ownership project, but it may be that it's a well-established entity. It might be that it's a well-established charity, for example, running different projects. And so in that instance, we have to be careful about protecting an existing entity and protecting those assets as well. Raising finance is going to be a really significant point in the context of choosing your legal structure. There are a number of different ways that communities will go about financing their investment, and the way that a project is going to be financed will also have an impact on the type of legal structure that can be used, what's most appropriate. And in some instances, actually, there is one structure that would be more appropriate depending on how you're going to finance that. Charitable status, again, is something that's worth considering at an early stage. Is the intention that charitable status is desirable? There are obviously a number of advantages associated with that, but in terms of investment itself, it's probably not going to be a charity, but potentially you could have a charity somewhere else in your structure, and that kind of ties in with the tax considerations, because there are a number of tax advantages there. So you can create yourself a really tax efficient model, and we'll come on to look at an illustrative example of that later on in the presentation. And the final kind of things to be thinking about are around kind of the composition of your entity and how you're going to structure that, both in terms of who your members can be, but also in terms of board composition, and how you tie that in with community engagement and accountability, and really how you kind of focus all of those things together for the model. So having regard to some of those kind of key considerations then, as I said, there are a variety of legal structures available and open to you, each with kind of advantages, disadvantages, and each of which may or may not be appropriate depending on the circumstances. So I'm just going to run through each of those in turn, and touch on some of the kind of key points of those. So the first on the list there is a SCIO, so a Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisation. SCIO model was purpose-built for the charity sector, and so the first thing to note, I suppose, there is that a SCIO is a charity. You can't have a SCIO without charitable status, and so that would tie in with the kind of considerations that we touched on there in terms of charitable status. The benefits of the SCIO model are, it's designed to be within a relatively simplified legal framework. It is governed by charity law and is regulated purely by the Office of the Scottish Charity Regulator. And so it's meant to be this kind of simpler form of structure, but tied to that, it has the benefits of the benefits that are often associated with other types of legal structures, such as a company, for example. So it has the benefit of limited liability for those who are involved in it, and it also has the benefit of having that separate legal personality, and so it can enter into contracts in its own name, as compared with, for example, an unincorporated association which doesn't have those benefits. A SKIO has a SKIO constitution, as compared with articles of association or rules, and by and large, it's a very popular model for organisations looking to set up as a charity. The next possible option in terms of legal structure is a BENCOM, or a society for the benefit of the community, which is a type of registered society, and it's primarily established for the benefit of the community at large, rather than for shareholders or members particularly. It's regulated by the FCA. It can have charitable status, and so in that case it would be dual regulated, but it's most likely to be appropriate where you are considering a community share issue in terms of raising finance for your community shared ownership project. If you are not considering a community share issue, it's less likely that you would look to the BENCOM as a model, but as I say, if that is something that you're considering, then that's most likely to be the model that you would utilise. The next two that we've got on the slide there are both company structures, something that many will be very familiar with, and are utilised across a variety of different sectors. Company limited by shares is something that we see fairly frequently in the community shared ownership space, as part generally of a kind of wider structure. Both companies limited by shares and companies limited by guarantee have some of those features that I mentioned in terms of a SKIO, and that is having the benefits of limited liability, and so protecting those who are kind of involved in the operation of those companies. There's also that separate legal personality. If charitable status is desirable, not likely for a company limited by shares, but certainly possible for a company limited by guarantee. Both are regulated by Companies House, and governed by company legislation. And if you're a charity, then you would obviously have that dual regulator aspect again with OSCR and with charity legislation. And finally, we've got an LLP, or a limited liability partnership, which again, we do see fairly frequently in this space. And Graham's going to touch on a bit of a comparison between an LLP and a company limited by shares in the context of a JV. So it is something that we do see fairly frequently. And for an LLP, you require there to be two or more parties carrying on a business with a view to profit. And so, in the context of a JV, it is absolutely a model that we would quite frequently see as well. And so turning then now just to the to some other kind of key requirements to be reflected in your corporate structure, and I've probably touched on these on the way through, but I suppose in a community shared ownership context, it's important that your corporate structure that's established allows for proper distribution of any surpluses. That's kind of the aim of the game here, is for the communities to benefit from these projects and to hopefully generate a surplus. And so it's really important that whatever corporate structure is established is able to appropriately distribute those surpluses. The protection against liability falling on community groups is something, again, we've touched on the way through there, and various of those structures do provide the benefit of limited liability, but really important for, community groups that are taking on these projects. It's potentially quite daunting to be, taking a step into this realm. And so it's really important that your structure that's in place provides you with the benefits of protection in those instances. And also, I think that really importantly is that your legal structure should allow for joint decision making in terms of distribution of funds. So it might well be that the community, this community vehicle that we're having to set up for the various community shared ownership projects is made up of a variety of different individual community groups, and so it's really important to, I suppose, structure it in such a way that all those voices can be heard as well. And finally, just before I hand over to Graham, I just want to run through some of the key features of the constitutional document. And I suppose, obviously, the structure will dictate what type of constitutional document you have. If it's a company, you would have articles of association. If it's a BENCOM, you would have rules. If it's a SCIO, you would have a SCIO constitution. But kind of quite at a basic level, there are certain things that you would have to reflect in each of those constitutional documents, albeit that they would be drafted in a particular way or in a slightly different manner. And the first of those is just around your objects and your purposes. Quite important, particularly in the context of a charity, but clearly defining for what purpose is this entity being set up, and that can be a really useful way of kind of focusing minds and attention as well. Geographical area of benefit, kind of linked, I suppose, to objects and purposes, but really important to have that clearly kind of defined from the get-go is, okay, where are these surpluses, where is the benefit going to fall here in terms of definition of that geographical area. Membership and board considerations are two of the other kind of really big kind of ticket items, I guess. Who is entitled to be a member of this entity? Is it going to be open only to community groups? Is it going to be open far more widely to all individuals residing in a particular postcode area, for example? And really closely linked to the membership considerations is considerations about the board and how you who is entitled to serve on your board and how that links with your membership. For example, if you've got, say, 12 community councils coming together, your membership's perhaps them, or do you want to have, a representative from each community council on the board? And so those are the types of questions that you would be asking at the kind of outset once you've established which legal structure is going to work for you. You then have to turn your attention to, okay, we have to have a constitutional document here. These are the types of things that you would need to be considering as part of that process. I'm now going to hand back to Graham, who's going to take us through a kind of spotlight on JVs. As we said, this is an area where we see quite a lot of work in our community renewables practice, and so we thought it was worth kind of spending a bit of time focusing our attention on that. So I will just hand back over to Graham just now. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Emma. So the part that I'm going to be talking about now is this focus on joint ventures. So the question being, and I think Mark had a session last week that was explaining, what is a joint venture and the different types of engaging and the different types of structure. So what we're looking at is where you are engaging, with, sometimes and most often the private sector, where effectively they may have an existing wind farm or maybe developing a wind farm or some other renewable energy project, including hydro, or it could be that you're looking to partner up with another third sector organisation, with a view to pooling resources, where you're feeling that you want to do this, and carry on a project, carrying on a project on your own. So looking at what are the types of legal structure that you might want to use for a joint venture. So the first one is a company limited by shares. And the other one is one mentioned by Emma of a limited liability partnership. So why would you want to use a company limited by shares? Well, primarily because these types of project are about generating profits, generating surpluses, which then can be passed back. So the private sector will be going back to their shareholders or parent body, and to the community. Ultimately, it will be going through to one of the BENCOMs or charitable organisations, after payment of any sums that have been borrowed, to make the investment. So looking at whether it is either a company limited by shares or an LLP, why would you use that? One, it creates that separate compartment. So ultimately what we mean by that is that if you borrow from the bank or from another funder, to make that investment, if it is the entity, a new entity that's invested, and there are no guarantees or any other commitments, or property is not mortgaged effectively to cover that risk, then effectively it's only that entity that suffers the risk. If the project should not go as well as expected, then effectively the charities or the development trust funds are secure and protected from from whatever happens within that risk compartment. It means that only the entity that's making the investment would be the one that would face that risk. It also provides a menu of options in relation to the capital structure and financial returns. So both with a company limited by shares, there can be different types of shares, different rights can be associated with shares. Some are voting, some are not voting. For example, some might have priority to share in dividends. So there are a whole menu that could be structured of how to how to create different types of rights and obligations within a company limited by shares. And a limited liability partnership can do similar things. It doesn't have that same share structure, but you still can give rights and capital rights and can set out how any profits or surpluses would be distributed to the members, and there can be a fine tuning of the approach, including obviously the amount our relative proportions of any surpluses that are distributed. So what are the key features of a limited liability partnership? So it's a corporate body, it's registered with Companies House, just like a limited company. There's a very straightforward process. So effectively there's a form that is completed that you don't actually have to file the LLP agreement. In fact, even to form an LLP, you don't even need an LLP agreement, not recommended, because the legislation effectively creates a default LLP, creates a default LLP agreement. So it is effectively, it's a document. So unlike articles of association, you don't file those with Companies House. You basically file the form to create your LLP, which has the name. You get your certificate of incorporation back. So it is a legal entity, but you never have to file that LLP agreement. That's kept effectively as a private document between the members or the partners of the LLP. So an LLP agreement, so I just said that, and the lighter touch regulation. So effectively, although a number of elements of the Companies Act, are applied to LLPs, that because they don't have the same shares, because as I said, they are just that little bit lighter, touch type, organisation, you still have to file who the members or the partners are with Companies House. You have to state who a designated member is, which is the equivalent effectively of a company secretary in a company. So as I said, there is that lighter touch approach. So in an LLP, what we find is that they only have the category of member. So unlike in a company where they have you can either have a member or a shareholder, and also a director. So you have two levels in a company. In an LLP, you don't actually have, you've only got the member category, and that works fine. So LLPs were created with the mind of lawyers or architects or other professional practices in mind, where it is primarily individuals, and so the individual would be the partner, would be the member of the LLP. But when we move this into a corporate context, so that you've then got companies like development trusts that actually are looking to establish an LLP, then sometimes we can then create that different body. We want to create a board of individuals, so you can have the member, the formal member, as the development trust or a charity or another organization, but you actually want to have humans effectively forming the board, and it would be those members, the development trust, the charity, or a new body effectively that would appoint those individuals who could constitute the board and run the LLP. Moving on to the next slide. So we're looking at the comparison of an LLP with a company limited by shares. So I think why would you go with an LLP? So a company limited by shares is still generally a more familiar structure than an LLP. LLPs are familiar to, as I said, the professional practices, but generally from a joint venture perspective, companies that are looking to form those joint venture relationships will in the main still have a company limited by shares, and if you're looking, if it is a joint venture where you are receiving an equity stake, generally that will be structured as a company limited by shares, and you get some shares effectively within that entity. It's also, I think, more difficult in an LLP to split, an equity stake. Ultimately, I suppose it's all about the capital that you have within that LLP and the voting rights that you get, by virtue of being a member of the LLP. And so there is that. It's not just a case of transferring a share, which would allow you quite readily to split. Effectively, you'd have to agree to amend the shareholders agreement, as well as altering the capital contributions that were recorded. And it can also be quite tricky. You're looking at the exit mechanisms. In a company limited by shares, effectively, if you want to get out, you sell your shares. And
how are you? Oh, are you?
Oh. That's sorry. I thought the slides weren't working again. So in a company limited by shares, as I said, that the exit mechanisms could be slightly more straightforward, because effectively you can just sell all of your shares, to a third party, and obviously there may be restrictions in who, whether you have to offer them to the other joint venture partner, or whether you are then free to sell them on the market. But in an LLP, one of the issues is that an LLP must always have two members. And if you have only one member for a period, I think it's of 6 months or more, then you lose the benefit of limited liability, which is obviously a big issue. And so obviously, as I said, you have to have that second member in an LLP. So there can be advantages, from an LLP perspective, and we'll come on to some of what those are. But just bear in mind that if you are dealing with generally a private sector party, they will probably be more familiar with a company limited by shares. And so again, looking at the further advantages of the company limited by shares with the LLP, it's I suppose lighter statutory framework for LLP, so it's more detailed, quite a lot more statutes. As I said, the Companies House book comes, and it seems to be growing thicker every year, and every iteration of the Companies Act. And as I said, it's now thousands. It's over 1,000 pages, maybe a couple of thousand pages now, I think, in terms of legislation of covering the companies and the legislation and the Companies Acts and the rules that go along with that. So again, there's quite a lot of rules that apply, and the LLP framework is much lighter than that. It's easier, effectively, to withdraw equity capital from an LLP. So that's, I suppose, a different approach to selling your interest. Effectively, you can withdraw, as long as it's permitted by the LLP agreement, you can withdraw your capital that you invested, from an LLP, and that's much more straightforward than it would be trying to, cash in your shares effectively. From a company limited by, there's a process you'd have to go through, and it's only permitted, where there are adequate profits effectively within the company, to enable that to happen. So, and there's also much more flexibility within an LLP structure, for decision making. You can structure it how you want, because we don't have the same issue with the two levels in a company. As I said, it is that sort of single structure, and your board effectively they're creating is something that is just created by the LLP agreement rather than by the statute. Wrongful trading provisions is another sort of point that we are sort of wanting to flag as well, and this is the wrongful trading provisions are insolvency, and so they apply equally to companies limited by shares and equally to LLPs, and what this means is that if the company is insolvent or is at risk and you cannot avoid what's called insolvent liquidation, and then effectively you have to take all steps necessary to protect the creditors, and generally that's stopping trading, and you're trying to minimize any risk. What it means is that if that you continue to trade, that you put your head in the sand and continue to run up costs, which creates even greater liabilities, when eventually everything all sort of falls to pieces, then effectively that your directors of a company and members of an LLP can potentially be personally liable for those debts, where as I said, they haven't taken all necessary steps to avoid, once it's become clear that there's no means of the company avoiding insolvent liquidation. So that in itself is a training session all of its own. So we won't say any more about that in this session. There also are, potential land and buildings transaction tax. So this is like the relatively new name for stamp duty that applied, when you are buying land. And the reason that there can be a saving when it comes to an LLP is that if one party owns the land and then transfer ownership of it to an LLP in which they are one of two equal members, then effectively the way that the revenue sort of looks at that is to say, well, although you've transferred that land into a new separate legal entity, we view you effectively as still owning, through the LLP, half of that land. And effectively what we're going to do is calculate the land on just half the value, because effectively you've only transferred half the value of that land, which is then held, through the LLP by the other member. Whereas if you transfer it into a company, then the way that the tax system works is that's viewed as a transfer of the whole of the, even though that you might be a 50% shareholder, it's still viewed as the transfer of the whole of the land into the company, and you would pay land and buildings transaction tax on the full amount of the transfer. So again, depending on the value of the land and the location of the land and the size of the land, that could be a saving for using an LLP if you already have that, if you already own the land. The tax transparency sort of element of it there as well. So that can be important. And what that means is that when you are a member of an LLP, unlike a company, so that when a company wants to issue a dividend, it has to pay tax on its profits before those dividends are paid, and ultimately then that is deducted from any dividends that are then paid out to the shareholders. So effectively you receive your dividends net of tax, corporation tax that's already been paid by the company. In an LLP, then it's what's called tax transparent. So the LLP doesn't pay corporation tax itself. Effectively, it's the members. So if there would be an allocation of a profit or surplus, even if those are not distributed, that's accounted for by the members. And so the members would be taxed on the basis of receipt of those surpluses or profits, as if they had received those, as if they had received those profits directly themselves. So again, they're taxed on their own status. That can create some benefits, where you have, tax exemptions or tax advantages. So for example, that's why you might see local authorities who are setting up vehicles like this using an LLP, because local authorities don't pay corporation tax. So if they use an LLP as a structure, then effectively any profit, for some sort of revenue generating exercise, and any profits that they generate are taxed in the same basis as the local authority is, and they don't pay any corporation tax on those. Where you have a charity in the structure, then effectively, particularly where we're using the two tiers of system, where you have a charity and a wholly owned subsidiary. If the wholly owned subsidiary is the member of the LLP, then it will receive the allocation of any profits, and it would be subject to corporation tax, on its share of those profits. But it can use the gift aid mechanism, where it has adequate funds available to make to transfer the gift aid to the charity, and can create quite a tax efficient arrangement whereby tax is not deducted at source as it would be in a company, but effectively they can use their charitable status effectively to get those funds up to the charity, which can then be used, those surpluses can then be used in furtherance of charitable objectives. And I think just to be absolutely clear on that sort of last point there, so that's the point I've just talked about. And although the subject, it says there that the subsidiary entity, which was the member of the LLP, so if it wasn't a charity, then it would be liable in tax in its own share of the profits. The other thing to remember as well is there may well still be, even if you have a charity in that structure, there may well still be some tax liability, because if there's a loan that's to be repaid, then effectively there might, from a tax perspective, there might still be funds that are not gift aided, and in which tax would still have to be paid. So it's always important when you are getting involved in setting up this type of entity, that you get advice, from an accountant that's familiar with these types of structures, and understand, what the tax liabilities may be, and how you could potentially maximise, the benefit of any structures, which do give you, the maximum possible relief. But even in those structures, there may well still be some tax liability. And I think we've covered that point as well. Ultimately, with that, company structure, which there could be dividends paid after the deduction of tax in the hands of the joint venture company. So I think we put up this diagram, and I know there's a risk in teams, particularly where people have got a small screen, and we created this illustrative example just to try and give you an idea. And at the top, and I don't know if you can see that because of the bar, there are 3 and 4 community organisations that are at the top. So it's 4 coming together to form this joint venture, and here they're forming a company limited by guarantee. So they have members of Group A, Group B, Group C, and Group D, and so on and so forth. Which each of which will represent a separate part of the community, to make sure that they've got that representation of for the board of directors. And it's important to remember, though, and this is again the subject of a different sort of topic, but when you are on that board, sitting on that company limited by guarantee as a director, although that you were appointed as a representative of your organisation, you have to act in the best interests of this company as a whole, and act rather than effectively what's in the best interest of your organisation. So again, it can be sometimes quite difficult for people who are appointed as directors into this type of organisation to make sure they've got the right hat on, and that they are clear, in the sense of, well, what's in the best interest of this new organisation. Underneath that, we have the wholly owned subsidiary company, and that wholly owned subsidiary company will be the one that will make the investment into the wind farm company, the joint venture, and will obtain the equity stake, and it will be entitled to receive any dividends, from that entity. What it can then do, because it is wholly owned, by the charitable company, it can gift aid its funds, back up, from the company limited by shares into the charity. The charity then wouldn't pay any tax, on those donations coming by gift aid, and then it is then free to spend those sums, in accordance with its own, charitable purposes, and it can give, small grants to local organisations and payments to other, community groups. The one element I suppose that's missing from that slide is that, in order to pay for that equity stake in the wind farm, quite often, the company limited by shares would have to, borrow, some funds, and there may well be, a requirement for, those funds to be repaid, and so normally you would then have, the company limited by shares, would have to make that repayment, and would need to make sure it was obtaining sufficient dividends, from the wind farm, to effectively make those loan repayments. And that's where the element of tax comes in. So any surpluses that it has left, as I said, can go by gift aid to the charity in a tax efficient manner, but amounts which of the dividends it receives from the wind farm equity stake that it has to hold on to with a view to repaying the loan can give rise, to a corporation tax charge. So it's important, again, just to make sure there is tax advice in relation to those, to those elements there. And I think the next slide, just summarises those key points there. So charitable status for the parent entity, which creates a tax efficiency, although, as I said, it could potentially be improved, through use of an LLP as the joint venture model. And the reason for having the subsidiary as well is because, ultimately this comes down to that if the charity was trying to take out a loan or wanted to guarantee a loan, there's a question of whether Oscar would view that as being compliant, with charitable law, charitable purposes. Is it effectively taking too much of a risk, you know, in a kind of relatively risky adventure, you know, in the use of charitable funds, and effectively could be in breach of, you know, the principles of charity law if that would, you know, wasn't regarded as a sound investment, which is why I think, you know, better to ring fence, you know, to ring fence the charities, funds, and activities, and go through the subsidiary entity to, you know, raise those funds, you know, for making the investment in the wind farm and you know, securing, you know, just effectively protecting the charities' funds by using that separate risk compartment for that investment. The other element, I suppose, is, you know, once the wind farm is hopefully up and operating successfully, it's about, you know, well, how is that money going to be distributed? It gets into the company, and the charitable company, and that's fine, it has everything, and it then has to decide that. But it is then possible, you know, to agree how those funds should be distributed. It may be, for example, that, you know, that one of the communities is closer to the wind farm, and you know, through agreement with the developer, that, you know, it should get a view taken, our agreement reached, that it should get a higher contribution. It may be that other, you know, areas have a greater need, and that again justifies us of a higher distribution. So again, you know, there's a lot of flexibility there in determining, you know, how, you know, how any funds received, you know, should be divvied up among the various community groups. Each member has the right to appoint, you know, a set numbers to the board, and the intention can be to admit future members, and you know, I suppose the question being, you know, is any member allowed to transfer their interest, you know, in the JV, but again, that is usually sort of tied down, you know, for a good number of years, you know, to prevent somebody from selling it. From a finance perspective, as I said, you know, you wouldn't, you know, be looking for a community share issue using that model. I think if you were going to go down the community share issue route, then that's probably when you want to look to the BENCOM, because of some of the, you know, the benefits that come from, you know, from that structure. But ultimately, I suppose there is that, you know, recognizing that, you know, some form of community share issue or community bond issue, you know, does give that sort of local connection and makes people interested in it. And we've mentioned the need for loan funding, most likely to, as along with some grant funding, to raise the funds, you know, to make that investment. And that is where we are at, and I think that has reached the end of the formal part of the presentation. I think we're now over to the Q&A.